Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this mayoral hustings for London. It's a complete honour to be your chair. My name is Samira Ahmed. I'm a journalist and a very proud Londoner. And it's organised by the End Violence Against Women Coalition, a UK-wide coalition of more than 100 women's organisations and others working to end violence against women and girls in all its forms. I don't need to tell anyone attending tonight that violence against women, while it's long always been an issue, has been particularly in the news in the last few weeks and months. And I'm sure it's something our candidates will be referring to. I'm delighted to welcome all the representatives from the different parties taking part in this. And I'll read you the names of all our panellists. These are in alphabetical order. From the Conservative Party, Councillor Louise Calland, who's the Greater London Authority candidate for Merton and Wandsworth. From the Green Party, Mary Iron, the Greater London Authority candidate for Bexley and Bromley. Mary, apologies if I said your surname wrong. Is it Ion?
It's Yon.
Yon, forgive me. It's my error for not having checked, so my apologies. Mary Yon. From the Labour Party, Sophie Linden, who's the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. From the Liberal Democrat Party, Irina von Wiese, the Greater London Authority list candidate. And from the Women's Equality Party, their candidate for Mayor of London, Mandu, Reid. Thank you all for joining this really vital conversation, all of you who are in the audience out there, on ending violence against women and girls ahead of elections for London's mayor on the 6th of May. It is, as I say, hosted by the End Violence Against Women Coalition, by Imkaan and by the Women's Resource Centre. Do use the hashtag VAWG London Hustings, all one word, to post on social media channels during this event. All the questions that you're going to hear asked are posed to panellists from specialist VAWG organisations and from those submitted by you attendees ahead of the event via Eventbrite. So we can't do a live Q&A from the audience due to the limited time we have for these hustings, but the questions will hopefully cover many of the issues of interest and have picked up on the themes highlighted and raised by attendees. There is a chat function on this too, which you can use to share comments throughout the event, and we will try and pass them on to the candidates' teams afterwards as well. As you may have noticed, we're delighted to have two British Sign Language interpreters for the event who will share the screen with the panellists when they are making their contributions. In addition, there is closed captioning provided, and if you want to see that, you need to click the CC button at the bottom right of the screen. Next to the raise hand, it says live transcript. So I hope that you're all able to access the contributions of our various speakers tonight with the help of either the captioning or our interpreters if you need them. Thank you. So format as well, I'll tell you. The chair is going to take each theme, that's me, and I'll pose questions around each theme, and the candidates will each have 3 minutes to respond as they wish to that theme. And I'll be keeping a stopwatch across it. But I'm going to hand you now to Andrea Simon of the End Violence Against Women Coalition to say a few words.
Thank you, Samira. Welcome everybody. The End Violence Against Women Coalition, Imkaan and the Women's Resource Centre have organised these hustings to put questions on key issues relating to tackling male violence against women and girls to parties standing for election for London Mayor on the 6th of May. Many of the member organisations that we collectively represent run services in London for survivors of domestic abuse, sexual violence and many other forms of violence against women. In the last year, they've been grappling with adapting their service provision due to the COVID pandemic, meeting huge demand for their services and increasing complexity in victims' needs, but nonetheless have continued to provide their life-saving support to women and children. Almost 1 in 3 women aged 16 to 59 will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. 2 women a week in England and Wales are killed by a current or former partner, Over 500,000 women are raped or sexually assaulted each year, and researchers found that over 1 in 10 women have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces. The murders of Nicole Smallman, Viva Henry, Sarah Everard, and many other women have placed a spotlight on male violence against women, and what we must do to prevent such tragedies is wide-ranging. Violence against women and girls crimes are a considerable proportion of all police emergency calls and is a part of day-to-day policing work. We know that in London, police recorded domestic abuse, sexual offences and rape have been increasing over the years, plus 117 forced marriage offences and 290 honour-based violence offences were recorded by police in London in 2018-19. A considerable number of the women and girls for which FGM or a related procedure was undertaken are also to be found in London. We would like to see pledges and action to ensure a coordinated approach is adopted in a dedicated violence against women and girls strategy, because we know this abuse does not take place in silos. The overlapping experiences of abuse many women will face during their lifetimes exacerbate pre-existing structural inequalities based on gender, race, class, sexuality, immigration status, and disability. The strategy to tackle violence against women and girls should be a priority for London's Mayor and should be designed with the input of specialist women's organisations. It should commit the Mayor and the local police force to addressing abuse of all women and girls in all forms, including the most marginalised women with no recourse to public funds, which the state consistently fails to protect. It should also ensure the best multi-agency working across policing, health and housing, which aims to prevent as well as respond to abuse. Additionally, we know the Mayor of London has significant powers as both London's Police and Crime Commissioner and with powers over public health planning and influence over London's boroughs. We want to see commissioners when deciding how victim services money should be spent, ensuring that specialist women's support services, including refuges, rape crisis centres, specialist services run by and for Black and minoritised women, deaf and disabled and LGBT abuse survivors are consulted, are treated fairly during commissioning processes, and are enabled to survive and meet growing demands for their services. And finally, we want to know how the police force can be held to account for their performance in responding to crimes of violence against women and girls, by ensuring there is adequate training and supervision relating to these crimes, and that both frontline officers and police leaders understand the specific problems that lead to low reporting rates and apply best practice in responding to abuse. I hope this will be a really informative event, and I very much look forward to hearing what our mayoral candidates and our panellists have to say about ending violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you so much for helping set the scene for this really important discussion. And thank you again to all those taking part in these hustings, all our candidates. The first theme for discussion, we've got about 15 minutes in total, is on violence against women strategy, a strategy and an action plan that's fit for all survivors. And there are 2 question areas I want to ask you all about. Firstly, if your party is elected, are you committed to maintaining and improving London's violence against women and girls strategy, which has made a huge difference since it was first drawn up in 2010? How will you ensure a new strategy works for all survivors, invests in prevention, and makes the links between all forms of violence against women and girls? And if elected, would you see the role of the mayor as not only overseeing strategy and spending on victim services, but also to speak out and name the patriarchal issues that underpin male violence against women and create barriers to women living free and equal lives? I should say all the candidates have seen all these questions. So the second question that goes with it in this area is about schools. In London, girls and young women experience disproportionately high levels of sexual harassment, violence and abuse. If elected, how will you provide leadership and involve schools and other agencies that already have contact with the young people to ensure that the particular needs of girls and young women at risk are specifically addressed? So for this first question, I'm going to go in alphabetical order. I'm going to start with Councillor Louise Calland of the Conservative Party.
Thank you so much, Samira. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is yes, in answer to the first question. I'm really, really pleased that to see that today actually Sean has signed up to the Safe Lives Pledge, which is the whole health approach to violence against women and girls. I think it's really important. I read their report the other week called We Only Do Bones Here, and it's essentially looks at the fact that only 1 in 5 women ever go to their GP to talk about domestic abuse. It's often the police, sorry, about domestic abuse is often picked up either A&E or by a GP. So it's incredibly important that we have this whole health approach to tackling particularly domestic abuse, but also violence against women and girls in general. I would also say that Sean actually has a lot of experience in talking to young men about this particular topic. He was a youth worker for 20 years. And one of the things he did during his time was to set up a club or a society for an under 18 men's pregnancy group. So talking to young men whose partners were pregnant about what it meant to be a father, how to have that conversation, how to support their partner through a big moment in their lives. So he is used to talking to young men and has a history of working with young men in this area, whether that's because their partners are having a child or about the proper way in which they should be treating young women. He also is very focused on prevention, which again, I'm incredibly thrilled to hear. So part of that is going to be waiver funding for 32 new youth zones, so one in each borough. So that's working with On-Side Youth Zone. And they offer a whole host of different options, such as creativity, sporting, enterprise activity, but basically it's to take the postcode lottery out of opportunity and give people the opportunity to talk to mentors that they might not otherwise get the opportunity to do so, and have a real example in their life where perhaps they don't have a stable influence or a stable advice giver in their life at that moment. So there'll be 32 new youth zones, and to go along with that, 4,000 new youth workers in London. So unfortunately, only 64% of youth organisations have received emergency funding, and 31% are struggling to operate and will continue to struggle for the next 6 months if they don't receive that funding. So Sean's pledge is to establish the new Mayor's Youth Service, which will allocate funding to those organisations, again, providing the resources and ensuring that young men have the places to go and have the people to speak to. Also to look at the second half of that question and looking at providing...
Just the last few seconds, I'm afraid.
Oh, just the last few seconds. Okay. So the second half of that question, I just want to talk very briefly about lobbying government for cyber flashing legislation. That is essentially the act under which young women get sent unwanted sexualized images. And that's one thing that Sean is really, really keen that we lobby government hard on to ensure that we get the proper legislation in place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I should say, I know there are videos for all of you, which I haven't introduced yet, but we'll show them at the end of this theme. So my apologies. Let's move on to our Green candidate next. Mary Ian, your thoughts on this issue, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I think I should just say before I start speaking about Green policy that I'm, as well as a Green Party candidate, I'm also a therapist who specialises in trauma. Many of my clients are women who've experienced violence, so that does impact, I guess, the way that I see some of these issues. In terms of what a Green Mayor would do, we would ensure that there are initiatives through the London Violence Against Women and Girls Consortium that are fully funded to meet the needs of survivors of violence and those facing domestic violence or harm. And these include advice and counselling, working to end harmful practices, including female genital mutilation and forced marriage, and integrated support for young women and girls. And we would also dedicate new resources to support independent domestic violence advocates within A&E and primary care, and also find new housing funding to improve options for move-on accommodation for women leaving refuges. And we would redouble efforts led by the Assembly since 2018 to introduce a national register of domestic abusers to help women identify and avoid risks from violent partners. It's clear that not only more resources, but new ways of working are needed across the board in sexual violence cases. And a Green Mayor will institute an urgent victim-led review of sexual violence in London, working from first principles and leading to new resources, improved police and support practices, calls for changes in the law and any other measures that are needed. And London's Victims Commissioner would take the lead on this work. In terms of girls and young women and schools and other agencies working with them, these have got a crucial role to play in being the first point of access for young women who are at risk and in need of support. And young women need to feel confident that they're safe to disclose their experiences and have clear knowledge about pathways to support and know that they'll be taken seriously. And the women that I've worked with, the young women I've worked with some who've not been able to tell anyone about what they've experienced, and in some occasions have actually been suspended from school and left with little support. So I also believe schools and other education settings have a vital role to play in providing innovative education programs to address the causes and prevent violence from men and boys. Training in trauma-informed approaches should be offered to all agencies working with
Last few
women and
seconds,
girls
please.
who've experienced sexual violence, as well as other initiatives to support witness and victims when they're going for police interview.
Fantastic. Mary, thank you so much. Our next candidate is the Labour candidate, Sophie Linden. Over to you on the theme for a strategy and action plan fit for all survivors.
Thanks a lot, Samira. Thank you very much to EVAWG, Imkaan and the Women's Resource Centre for organising this hustings for us to be able to talk about the mayoral candidates and what we'll do. The main thing I wanted to say was I would judge Sadiq on his record. Since 2016, he has implemented a strategy against violence against women and girls, and he has backed it up with record amounts of investments. Over £60 million has been put into ensuring not only that victims have the supports that they need when they are when they become victims of violence, but also that we actually start to tackle the root causes and tackle the behaviour and the reasons why women and girls in London aren't safe and are, experiencing far too much violence. And of course, in his manifesto that Sadiq published during this campaign, there's a very, very clear commitment to publish, to refresh and quickly publish a new strategy on tackling violence against women and girls, taking what we call a public health approach, which is really about making sure that we not only look really importantly at supporting victims, which Sadiq has put record amounts of investment into, but we ensure that we tackle the behaviour of men, because we have to make sure that we really understand what is causing this violence against women and girls. And we've got to tackle that behaviour. We've got to tackle the structures and the structural sexism and misogyny that's causing the problems for women and girls in London. And we also have to make sure that means we work on prevention. We work on within schools on sex and relationship education that teaches dignity, respect, and consent. And we work with families as well. But I'm really keen not to just put the whole burden onto schools, and so is Sadiq, because of course, really important, the education, but we've got to be really clear that if young women and girls and women are working, living and growing up in a society that has within it just deeply misogynistic and sexist structures, it's going to cause violence. We have to look at it right across the piece. And so Sadiq is absolutely committed to tackling the structural causes to sexism, to ensuring that there is equality for women. And he's put in place many initiatives and programs to ensure that women are able to have the jobs that they deserve, fulfill the skills and fulfill their aspirations, really importantly as part of that work to tackle violence against women and girls. And finally, really importantly, we have to make sure we tackle the perpetrators, not just in educating what is the right behaviour and educating around respect, but ensuring that those men who are perpetrating sexual violence, domestic abuse, FGM, honour-based violence, that when a woman reports and has the bravery and has the strength to report, that they are brought, not only are they brought to justice, but that there are schemes and programs in place to change their behaviour, like the investment in the DRIVE programme that Sadiq is committed to continuing.
Sophie, thank you so much. Our next candidate is the Liberal Democrat candidate, Irina von Wiese. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and for giving me the opportunity. I should say that I know Louise, our mayoral candidate, very well. We were both members of the European Parliament together, and I know from my first-hand experience that we both fought for women's rights, for ratification of the Istanbul Convention and other pertinent issues, and I know how strongly she feels about this. I hope I can speak for her in this hustings. I myself have a legal background. I worked for state prosecutor on sexual offences against women during my legal training. And I also joined Liberal Democrats because I was a civil rights activist and have hence worked for mainly refugee charities and hosted refugees in my home, amongst them victims of modern slavery, all of them women, by the way. So I feel really strongly about this. And I think in answer to your first question, you know, of course, we are committed. I have also assigned the pledge for the holistic approach to ending violence against women. Specifically, I think the focus, as we've heard before, has to be on education. Now, obviously, education is not within the mayor's directorate, but there are lots and lots of things that the mayor can do to work with local authorities, to work with schools. I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I know how important it is to start education early. Education for all groups, education obviously for boys, but also for girls around consent, but also around issues that were mentioned earlier, such as forced marriages, FGM, and honor-based violence. And I think that can't start early enough. And the more we invest in our children and their education from a really early age, the more I think that will bear fruit at a later age. The other thing is investment in safe places and shelters for women to have a place to go. And that means, amongst other things, tackling inequality. That means physically making spaces available. Louise has put out a program, which is rather radical new program on housing and maximizing use of public land, and in particular, bringing empty properties back into use. And I've seen firsthand how that can work in my own borough in Hammersmith and Fulham, where various properties have been transformed into places where shelter can be taken. And credit to the council for doing that. I think we all have to work together on this. And then, thank you. And the third one is, as was mentioned before, is tackling response to crimes and hold, you know, as
just a sentence, please. Sorry.
Yes, and I think we have to talk about the fact that there were more than 100,000 more reported crimes that were screened out within 24 hours of being reported in 2020 than there were in 2019. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this later.
We absolutely will. Thank you so much. Right. And our final candidate on this theme is Mandu Reid, who is the mayoral candidate for the Women's Equality Party.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you to the organisers of this event. It's so important that we're discussing this. It is really important for London to have an ending violence against women and girls strategy, but London must not follow the government's lead, which frames domestic abuse as a gender-neutral crime and also delinks domestic abuse from other forms of violence against women and girls. This risks deprioritizing other forms of violence against women and girls, including those that disproportionately affect minoritized women. The current London strategy is solid, but what's missing, I think, and what might explain what's happened over the last 5 years, which is that rates of domestic abuse, rates of sexual assault have actually gone up. They've gone in the wrong direction. Charge rates for sexual assault are now 1/7 of what they were when this mayor came to office. So the strategy is good on paper, but what's missing is investment that meets the scale of the challenge. We talk about record levels of investment, but it's kind of easy to break records when you're starting from a very low base. We need significantly more investment than's been put in place. We also need clear targets and accountability with the right leadership to drive a fully holistic response. And the thing that happens in these conversations is we often overemphasize policing. Policing is of course important, but to really address this, I'm proposing that we create a new deputy mayor portfolio that's responsible for ending violence against women and girls so they can join the dots between housing, education, specialist service, and yes, policing, which is all part and parcel of fixing this issue. As mayor, I won't only speak up, I will show up. And I'm just going to be candid and say it is disappointing that I'm the only mayoral candidate here today representing the campaigns. Just a few weeks ago, any politician you could think of was talking passionately about how this is such an important issue in the aftermath of Sarah Everard's murder, and the news cycle's moved on, and it feels like the true focus and emphasis on this issue has moved on with it, and that won't cut it. About equality, absolutely. That is the entire Women's Equality Party's manifesto. The power asymmetry between men and women is a key factor in what creates violence against women and girls. And we're offering that when you consider absolutely any part of what the mayor is responsible for. We want to close down inequality in order to address this issue. And finally, the points around young women and schools. We've got to listen to young women. Groups like Everyone's Invited have made some good headway. We've got to engage with young men. And what I would do as mayor is I would leverage existing mayoral schemes, such as the mayor's Healthy Schools program, of which 2,206 schools are up and registered, so that we can go straight to source and put programs in place that actually start talking to our kids from primary school age upwards, and we don't have to start from ground zero on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mandu. Now, all the mayoral candidates, including Mandu, prepared a video for us. And we're going to play that now. It actually starts with Mandu, but it has all the main mayoral candidates. And then we'll continue with our discussion around the various themes for tonight.
While gang crime hits the headlines, the daily reality of women and girls in London is often overlooked. Safe streets and a safe transport network are not a luxury, they are a necessity. So as mayor, I will roll out CCTV cameras from day one. I will bring in 1,000 new police officers to specialist units to guarantee the safety of women and girls across London. I'll bring in guaranteed 24-hour patrols in the areas where women feel the most vulnerable. Currently, there are no CCTV cameras on the Central Line, the Bakerloo Line and the Piccadilly Line. So those carriages have no internal protection. I will put these cameras in place so we can catch and prosecute people who are committing these offences. In the last 4 years under Sadiq Khan, sexual attacks on the underground system have soared by 43%. It is important that we eradicate these black spots and increase security for women and girls across London. I'll provide 1,000 more police officers in focused units focused on tackling violence against girls and women, both publicly and in a domestic setting as well. I'll work to support the ongoing training and provision for safeguarding detectives, who deal with the most complex cases. I'll introduce 24-hour foot patrols in parts of London where women feel vulnerable. And increased police presence has a direct result on lowering crime in that area and increasing the safety for women and girls. A YouGov poll found that 1 in 3 women are taking regular steps to protect themselves from sexual assault and avoiding certain areas. So I feel these measures are really a good step to making London safer. Under my mayoralty, I will play a big part in addressing the plight of women and girls in London, how they're regularly harassed and regularly attacked. It's time to take this problem on from a policing point of view and, of course, a cultural point of view, and I will lead the conversation in that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me to speak to this debate, and I hope you've seen the strong commitment Greens have to ending violence against women and girls today. I've been a vocal supporter of groups working on the front line in support of women affected by violence, and I've spoken up about the issue in the wake of the shocking murder of Sarah Everard and during debates and hustings so far in this campaign too. In my work on the London Assembly, I've been particularly concerned about cuts cuts to lots of services, but also to specialist groups who support women from different minority, religious or cultural groups, and about how the hostile environment policies of the government can put women in danger if they cannot rely on funded support to leave a dangerous situation. Our manifesto has policies in all areas that deal with the reality of violence in society and seek to build a truly healthy society where no one is unsafe and where people have options when things go wrong, so that they know where to get help at a time that makes a difference. I hope you'll read all our policies to see this broad public health approach in action. And finally, we need justice where violence takes place. Misogyny must be recorded like any other hate crime, and we need more resources to solve cases and bring justice for survivors. It's awful to see that rates of detection and sanctions against perpetrators have fallen in recent years, and that is not good enough. On the London Assembly, I've seen with my own eyes the problems within police teams facing huge workloads and inadequate resources, the lack of contact time with independent sexual violence advocates, and massive challenges due to the volume and intrusiveness of digital evidence required from victims. Fixing all this, it's a question of priority, and as Green Mayor, I hope you'll see that I will give the right priority to this problem that should be in the past. Thank you.
Hello, it's Sadiq Khan here. I want to start off by saying thank you to the End Violence Against Women Coalition for giving me the opportunity to send this message. I'm absolutely determined to ensure that every woman feels safe and is safe in our city. But I know that there's still a gap between this ambition and the lived reality of far too many women and girls who too often experience the scourge of sexism, abuse and violence. That's why I'm clear that we must take a zero tolerance approach to all forms of misogyny, abuse and violence towards women. You've asked me for 3 areas I'll focus on if re-elected. First, I'll refresh my violence against women and girls strategy so that it takes a public health approach to ensuring women and girls are safe in our city. Second, I'll take steps to design out crime in the public realm and expand my night safety charter. I'll also continue campaigning for misogyny to be permanently included in the definition of a hate crime, making sure that we can get that written into law, as well as calling for sexual harassment to be made a specific offence. And finally, I'll continue to be upfront about saying that the unacceptable attitudes and behaviours of men must be addressed. So, in addition to continuing to invest in programmes to change the behaviour of those who abuse women, I'll continue to support men and boys being educated about sexism, misogyny, and the importance of respect and consent. If I'm re-elected on May the 6th, tackling violence against women and girls will be at the very heart of my plans to build a brighter future for all Londoners. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Louise, the Liberal Democrat candidate for Mayor of London, and I want to just start by thanking you for raising the topic of ending violence against women and girls, because we've seen from the events of recent weeks how important it is that our voices are heard and we finally take action to end misogyny, which is the root cause of why this is happening. The aftermath of the tragic death of Sarah Everard has prompted a national conversation about how, as women, we can be safer and be treated as equals in our society. But I don't want this to be just another conversation that we have and move on from, like with the Me Too movement. I want to see action to bring about real change across our society. So one of the things that I would do as mayor is make sure that the police are held accountable for their actions, that when women report a crime that's happened to them, that they are taken seriously in the first instance, that policing is proportionate. We saw the way that the vigil on Clapham Common was policed completely disproportionately, male officers' knees on young women's backs. This shouldn't be happening in a modern society. And that's why I also want to create a women's board to hold the mayor to account on their strategy for ending violence against women and girls, because we need women's voices at the heart of this process, shaping policy, making sure that that strategy is effective and that things are progressing as quickly as we need and want them to. And finally, my Liberal Democrat colleague Caroline Pidgeon on the London Assembly has been leading a campaign to make sure that women who are trying to flee domestic abuse have an easier way of getting out of that situation by at least having access to free travel, a free journey, so that they can escape that situation. So that's a campaign that I will be taking up and will implement if I become Mayor of London. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, and let's continue the fight for equality together.
To end male violence against women and girls in London, we need City Hall to step up. Since the current mayor came into office, rates of domestic abuse and sexual assault have soared, and charge rates for sexual violence are 1/7 of what they were in 2016. Women expect and deserve better. So instead of putting more bobbies on the beat, I would invest the 42 million a year raised by increasing council tax on a whole society approach with anti-racism at its heart. An approach that recognises policing is only part of the solution. And to lead this work, I will create a new deputy mayor for ending violence against women and girls, to connect the dots between policing, housing, specialist services, and education. My 3 priorities are: number 1, ensuring that no woman fleeing violence is ever turned away from safe refuge and making London a sanctuary city for migrant women. Number 2, investing in prevention, including a properly funded perpetrator strategy and a register for serial perpetrators, education interventions from primary through to university, and public awareness campaigns to help create the cultural and behavioural change needed throughout society. Number 3 is reforming policing in London. This includes a rapid review and action to address institutional sexism and misogyny within the Met, working with the women's sector to create specialist policing units trained in trauma-informed practice, and making sure that more women have access to an IDVA or an ISVA. Vote for the Women's Equality Party on the 6th of May, and you can count on us to keep the pressure up inside City Hall, day in, day out. Thank you.
Thank you all to all the mayoral candidates for their films there. And I know there are comments that attendees have been posting in the chat. We will be passing them on to all our speakers at the end of this event. I'm going to move on to our next theme, which is police accountability, a theme that many of our mayoral candidates raised in that film there. I know it's one that many of the attendees are raising as well. 2 questions to go in this theme. 15% of all recorded sexual offences take place in the capital, and domestic abuse accounts for around 1 in 10 offences. Whilst more women than ever are seeking justice by coming forward to the police, it's still the case that most survivors, victims of rape, will never get justice. Confidence in the criminal justice system has been impacted by a catastrophic failure to effectively investigate and prosecute rape and domestic abuse. What would your party do to ensure accountability of the police in London on tackling violence against women and girls. And a question submitted from the audience on this theme of police accountability: how can abuse rooted in sexism, misogyny and racism within the police force be addressed and officers held accountable for their behaviour towards women and girls? So this theme, police accountability, 3 minutes for each of our candidates. I'd like to ask the Labour candidate, Sophie Linden, to address this first. Over to you.
Sure, sorry, I thought you were going to go alphabetically again, so that certainly caught me off guard. Thanks a lot. In terms of police accountability and the rates of prosecutions, successful prosecutions for rape, domestic abuse, and also other forms of violence against women and girls, I've been really clear, and so Sadiq all along, and as has the Commissioner, that they are woefully low and they absolutely need to increase. So one of the things that the Mayor did was appoint Cllr Waxman as the Independent Victims Commissioner for London. Really, she has prioritised her work looking at rape. She's done a deep dive rape review, looking at cases of rape and what happens in relation to women who have the strength to report but are not able to take it all the way through. And that is no criticism of the women, because we know that what they have to go through is re-traumatizing. It takes too long to get to court, and then when they are in court, it is incredibly difficult for them. Now, one of the major things that her review found was the support that women need in order for them to take from report to get to prosecution. Sadiq has absolutely invested in that support for victim services. So we've put in place the accountability mechanisms for police and across the criminal justice system, because this isn't just about policing, and we've also putting in place the support mechanisms and what the survivors need in order to be able to take their cases forward. However, we've got to be really clear that, you're right, Mandu, it is a record amount of investment, £60 million in tackling violence against women and girls, but it's not sufficient. We need the government to step up and not only put together a coherent, a holistic strategy to tackling violence against women and girls, but to invest in it, invest in the services for support, and invest in the police officers and the police officers and the training so that we know that there are enough police officers to be able to undertake this work, but also to invest in the CPS, to invest in the support services and taking cases through the criminal justice system, and to invest in the courts. We are now at crisis points within the criminal justice system. COVID has exacerbated what was there already in terms of the court backlog. So we've got a lot to do. So this is not just about police accountability. Sadiq recognises, and if he's re-elected, he will continue to hold the police to account. We need to ensure there's a question around how do you make sure the police fulfill their duties and their responsibilities. That is about training. That is about the unconscious bias training around discrimination. We are really clear that we've got more to do within the Met to make sure that they are there, they are responding appropriately when women are calling and young girls are calling for their service. We're really clear that police accountability has to be there. They have to be well trained, professional, and they need to have the support and the backroom support, or what was called the backroom support, in order to do their jobs properly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Exactly 3 minutes. Appreciate it very much. I'm trying to make sure that every speaker gets to have a chance to be first, second, third, fourth and fifth in terms of order. So I'm mixing it up a bit. Our next speaker is answering this question on police accountability is Liberal Democrat presence tonight, who's Irina von Wiese. Your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Thank you, Samira. And yet, speaking as a lawyer and former prosecutor, it seems to me that there is a balance to be struck here. And I'm afraid the Mayor has not really been able to strike this balance. And the balance is that on the one hand, we do need to have investment in prosecution services, in the police, and the training of the police. We urgently need to ensure that more of the reported crimes actually get to prosecution and are not screened out within 24 hours, which unfortunately is what has happened. I mentioned earlier, I think the increase between 2019 and 2020 was more than 100,000 increase in cases that were screened out. And I don't think it's a surprise that we've seen confidence in the Met fall to a low of 56% under Sadiq Khan. And we have to enable police to do their job, and that means of course, doing the opposite of what the Conservative government in Westminster has done over the past decades, and which was to cut numbers further and further. That is one side of the balance. On the other side, we've also seen the really quite shocking images that came from Clapham Common. And although I know this is a very difficult thing to assess from the outside, it does seem to me that there was no proportionality in the reaction of police forces in this particular case that broke up this completely peaceful vigil at some point in time. And I think there needs to be proper training in place. The Sarah Everard vigil should have been allowed in the first place. I am convinced that we would not have seen these scenes of violence in the end, and of forcible restrictions of peaceful demonstrators had the protest been allowed to go ahead. So there also needs to be this insurance that there is proportionality in the police force, and that requires, I'm afraid, a lot more further action and a lot more further training than has been achieved in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next candidate to address this issue of police accountability is the Women's Equality Party candidate for Mayor, Mandu Reid.
Thank you, Samira. Some were surprised, and they've said so, about the heavy-handedness of the policing at the vigil on Clapham Common. But for many of us, including people on this call, police brutality, police misconduct, police disregard, police disrespect are not news. And when I say many of us, I'm talking about Black and minoritized women. For us, this is not brand new news. And I don't have anything against police officers as individuals. My mother, a Black woman, a middle-aged Black woman, was a police officer for 7 years. But we do have an issue inside the police force. Racism's part of it, but there's also an issue of institutional sexism and misogyny that at the very least needs to be examined. 600 allegations of sexual misconduct by Metropolitan Police Service employees in the last 6 years, a fifth of which were upheld. Can you imagine another employer with that volume of allegations and we would just shrug our shoulders and take no notice? But this is a force that is intended to serve and protect. This is a serious issue. And then there was the appalling behavior of officers who posed for selfies with the dead bodies of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman in the summer of 2020. They are still employed by the Met. We have to address these issues. I would institute a rapid review to examine these, taking cues from the McPherson review, which looked at institutional racism in the aftermath of Stephen Lawrence's death. And there'll be an action plan that comes out of that. It'll be an independent review to really tackle these issues and have zero tolerance for them, because we have to rebuild trust between women and girls, the 4.5 million women and girls of this city who deserve and expect a police force that will stick up for them. So in terms of accountability, I think we do need clear targets and we need clear transparency. And what I would do as mayor is I would be asking questions every quarter, and I'd be publishing what's going on every quarter against all of these key indicators. And I will be saying to the commission, I'll be saying to the deputy mayor that I'm going to appoint, what are we going to do about it if these things are going in the wrong direction? Of course, there's an argument that government needs to play its part, but my mayoralty won't be about finger pointing. It'll be about taking action as the Police and Crime Commissioner to do what the people of London have elected me to do.
Thank you so much, Mandu. I'd like to call now on the Conservative representative, East Hustings Councillor Louise Calland. Your thoughts on the issue of police accountability?
Thank you. So for me, this whole question is about trust. I first want to say that one of our pledges is to appoint a Deputy Mayor for Women and Equalities. It's obviously a brilliant idea, as I know another party has also mentioned it, but that would make sure that there was someone who looked at these cross-cutting issues across different departments. But I do want to go back to the idea of trust, specifically trust in the Metropolitan Police. And for me, this is about two things: ensuring that they have the resource that they need to, and that women feel there are as few barriers as possible to them being able to report and go through the prosecution process if that is the route that they would like to go down. So first off, in terms of resource, we will be putting in place 1,000 more police officers to tackle violence against women and girls. That is 500 police officers who will be in local specialist safeguarding units. And that's 500 British transport officers who will be there to ensure that, as Sean was talking about earlier, make women feel as though they are safer when they travel on public transport. That's in addition to the CCTV cameras as well that he mentioned in his opening video. So that's more resources, but more specialist resources and where we need them. So it's not boots on the ground, it's people who have that specialist knowledge and ability to help women where they need it. We also want to put in place more resource for domestic refuges. Actually, do you know that at the moment there isn't a refuge in every London borough? And I find that amazing and appalling. And so Sean's pledge is that there will be a refuge in every single London borough that can accommodate victims of domestic abuse. And he's going to put in place £16 million to provide those 130 refuge spaces to ensure that women always feel as though they have somewhere to go, a safe space where they want to go. So we're not just putting resource into the police, but we're also putting resource into safe spaces for women as well, ensuring that they have somewhere to go. And then I'm going to come back to trust again. And the way in which we see this is by establishing an office for community policing. So in my ward, we have a safer neighbourhood team. I know our local police officer. He's called Adrian. He's 6 foot and got ginger hair. You can't miss him when he walks down the street. And he holds regular coffee mornings where people can go up to him, talk to him, and tell them what their concerns are, where they feel unsafe. And he can get that local knowledge, but it also makes him a real person. So women feel as though they have that community link and that community specialist that they can go and speak to. So this office essentially is going to do a wide scale rollout of the police body of those, but also as well, I think there is something to be said about body worn cameras. My last point, I think they will increase trust hugely in the police force and will hopefully help women feel as though they are again protected whenever they want to talk to a member of the policing force.
Councillor Calland, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, and our Green candidate, Mary Ian, your thoughts on police accountability, please.
Thank you. I mean, as we've heard, sexual violence cases have more than doubled in recent years, but the rates of detection and sanctions have fallen. And the majority of women I work with have never received justice from our system and live with the knowledge that the perpetrator's free to act again to harm either them or other women, and the implications that has for people's recovery is enormous. As we heard from Sian Berry in her video, she's explored some of the problems that police teams have with huge workloads and inadequate resources, and as others have said, we need to make sure that they have the right resources and specialists working alongside them. One of the things that we would urgently review is that the end of intrusive digital searches that really discourage survivors and victims from taking action against sexual and domestic abuse. The Mayor and Assembly members do have powers to hold the police to account, and Sian Berry and other Green Assembly members will stand up for all Londoners, whatever their background is, and ensure that policing is not racist or misogynistic. And we treat misogyny as a hate crime and have the police and record and treat more seriously crimes that are motivated by or exacerbated by hatred of women. And this would be backed up by additional training and communication. And police need to have further training in order to be able to adopt a trauma-informed approach throughout their work on violence. And there needs to be a focus on embedding an understanding of the impact of trauma in police practices and training. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, our next theme, and it's something that a lot of attendees have been raising in the chat, which is a concern about the needs of particular communities which perhaps are not being addressed. So this next theme is on independent women-led specialist support services, including services led by and for Black and minoritized women and girls, deaf and disabled, and LGBTQ+ survivors. And we have 3 questionnaires in here, which our candidates are going to reflect on. London should be proud of its network of specialist violence against women and girls independent support services, but they're facing huge funding pressures, massively increased demand for their services, and greater complexity of cases due to the COVID pandemic, which will have lasting consequences for women and girls. If elected, what would your party do to ensure that the specialist women's support sector is protected and able to survive in these difficult times? Is your party committed to the continued long-term funding of London's rape crisis centres and specialist by and for provision for deaf and disabled and LGBTQ+ survivors? An audience question on this theme: what will you do to support community-based by and for organisations providing specialist services for Black and minoritized and migrant women, ensuring their services don't get taken over by large national generic organisations with no links to the community? And another question that's coming from the audience: how will your parties, if elected, ensure the disproportionately high levels of violence against deaf and disabled women are tackled and barriers to support them are addressed? So I would like to start this theme with the Liberal Democrat candidate, Irina von Wiese. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by just saying that it is absolutely appalling that women and girls who are already vulnerable would be targeted specifically by sexual violence. But that very sadly is the case. And I've seen that in my own charity work on a number of times. And I think we're going to speak specifically about migrants later. But Liberal Democrats generally believe in decentralization. I think it is very, very important that those people who provide services are members of those communities that are affected. They know best what can be done realistically, and therefore trying to centralize and somehow monitor and control these groups can only be counterproductive. So decentralization is key to this, and of course with decentralization comes decentralized funding, which is another thing that Liberal Democrats have always pressed for, of course, to the level and down to whatever level is best placed. And the other thing is that those groups need to be expert-led, and I, as I say, I always assume that the people who are who've been working with survivors on the ground, but also the survivors themselves are those experts, and they should, they should get the lead in this. We very much support ongoing financing of the rape crisis centres. I'm very proud to say that another of Louise and my former colleagues in the European Parliament is head of one of the rape crisis groups, and we are working, very hard with these organizations to make that possible. They do need much, much more support. And as we've seen the explosion of domestic violence cases during the lockdown, I think that has become more urgent than ever. You would see that at a national level, Liberal Democrats have a very strong care agenda. This is indeed part of this care agenda, and it needs to be locally driven. I hope that will also answer the third question, which means that maybe add to this that support for disabled group needs to be integrated with support for victims of domestic violence, so that women can access specialized support where they are doubly affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Perfectly 3 minutes. Now, as some of you may have noticed, Louise's 4-month-old child is with her. I was going to call on you next, but would you rather I came back to you a bit later? It's your
no,
call.
that's absolutely fine. I'm about to hand him back to his dad for bath time.
Excellent. So yes, so I was going to call on you next. So, and as Irina has pointed out, we do have another theme to come, which is very specifically on structural inequalities for Black and minoritized and migrant women. But in the broader theme of this, your thoughts would be most welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. So for me, this is again all about removing barriers for women in this area, and I will come on in the next question to talk more specifically about people with little resource or funds. Hold on one second. Thank you. So for me, the main thing I want to talk about here is a multilingual domestic abuse helpline. So this is to ensure that all victims of domestic abuse can access support regardless of their background. So roughly 770,000, I think, people in the UK speak little or no English, and 21% of those live here in London. So for me, the idea that we don't currently offer this is, I think, is a big barrier to lots of women feeling as though they are able to talk to some of these specialist centres or feel as though they would be able to feel comfortable enough talking about something very personal, something very traumatic often for them in a language that just isn't their first language. So the things that we want to do are things like that multilingual domestic abuse helpline to help women feel as though there are as few barriers as possible to them accessing the support that they need. In terms of specialist groups, I think the way that the Mayor can do this is by helping a lot of local authorities oversee that. So where I'm a councillor in Wandsworth, what we do is we have a grants fund where what we do is we encourage community groups to bid to the local authority for the funds that they need to carry out the services, because often they will have the roots within the community, they will know the women who they need to be speaking to, and they'll be able to get in touch with a lot of people who might feel as though they don't want to come and talk to a local authority, talk to the council, talk to City Hall. So yes, we absolutely see the need to keep funding those kind of smaller specialist groups who do such great work in this area.
Fantastic. I was also just thinking how delightful it is to have the effortless multitasking as we go, handing the baby over to the partner. So thank you very much for your ability to just go with the flow on that. I'd like to call on our Green candidate next, Mary Ian, to comment on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I agree. It's all about accessibility and people being able to access support that most meets their needs, and it's vital that people feel confident that they're going to receive appropriate and understanding support when they need help, that they have access to interpreters, etc. And a Green Party mayor would defend and promote these services across London, particularly in the face of austerity or any potential future cuts. We would fight to maintain funding for these services. And I know a lot of these services have been really struggling during the pandemic, and we need to be able to fund them so that they can be more resilient, not have to close their waiting lists when we're in a crisis such as this. We can expect further problems in the future. We need to make our services resilient and be able to be accessible to different people. The Green Party's committed to the principle of nothing about us without us, and we specifically have a policy about involving disabled people's representatives more closely in policy making at the highest level across all of the mayor's work, including working with the police to tackle disability hate crime. And the Green Party's committed to ensuring that specialist community services have secure funding, and we've specifically committed in our manifesto that these will be funded without seeking to merge them into generic services. Thank you. You're on mute.
There would always be one moment when I did that. I apologise to everybody for that. Sorry. Thank you so much. And on this topic, I think the Labour candidate, Sophie Linden, the Labour representative in this case, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Just to be absolutely, clear, in terms of funding for rape crisis centres, absolutely, totally committed to it, and have been throughout the administration when I've been Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. And we've not only tried to put rape crisis centre funding onto a more sustainable footing, but where we can and where we have found the money, we have put extra money in, because it genuinely breaks my heart when I hear all too often in London, rape crisis centres and other services for women who've suffered violence having to close their waiting lists, and that's through no fault of the people. It must be even more, well, no fault of the people who are having to do that, and it must be so difficult for those women and those professionals working with those women having to turn people away. And I do not want to be in London to be in that position. So absolutely, there is that commitment. In terms of specialist services for minoritised, Black and minoritised women, again, as I said at the beginning of this really good discussion, I think we should look at Sadiq's record, and his record speaks for itself. Just last month, he announced £3 million worth of investment, which was specifically for community-led grassroots organisations, because we know how important it is for women from whatever ethnic background or whatever ethnicity to be able to find the specialist service and culturally specific service that they need, and that they can access and understand them, know how important that is. There's over 30 community organisations now being funded through the Mayor of London. And what really encouraged me about that was these were not services, some of them were services that we knew already and had a relationship with already, but we had many very small grassroots organisations coming forward to be, to be funded. And that is a commitment going forward. Talked about strategy and developing a violence against women and girls strategy at the beginning of this evening's debate and discussion. Again, my commitment and Sadiq's commitment is, if Sadiq is re-elected, when we develop that strategy to tackle violence against women and girls, our commitment is ensure that we understand the needs and the demands and what is needed in London from all women, and the intersectional nature of the services that are needed for women and for young girls. And my commitment is to go back out after the election to talk to specialist providers and talk to communities as to what they need going forward. We've put in place funding that is there already. Our commitment is to carry that funding on, and the commitment is to make sure that we understand the needs of Londoners and of all Londoners. In relation to, we've also, there's the specialist services. We also fund and invest in the London Victims and Witness Service, so that those women who are taking cases forward, who have been not just taking cases forward, but for women, again, we were very clear when we commissioned that service that we needed to ensure that there was specialist provision within it. We will continue that, and we will continue to make sure that that specialist provision is there. Again, and I'm not shrugging my shoulders in any way, Mandu. Again,
last few seconds.
We do need the investment. We can do what we can from City Hall, but we can't do everything from City Hall. We need to work with boroughs, but we also need to work with government to make sure that we meet that demand.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie. And my apologies, Mandu, I haven't yet called on you, have I, on this topic? No, sorry, I was meant to call on you fourth. So my apologies, but over to the Women's Equality Party candidate.
Thank you. A lot of what needs to be considered in relation to specialist services comes down to the funding models and commissioning approaches and how resources actually get distributed. And so one of the things that can be done from City Hall is set an example in that regard. And I'd want to see over the years ahead, MOPAC build on some of the good work they've done in this space around making sure that funding for these kind of services is not done on a short-term basis, because otherwise these organizations are precariously trying to plan year on year, and they don't have capacity to constantly be applying for funding. A minimum term should be 3 years. What we need to do is match need and demand to provision, and not just hope that what we commission meets like the most important needs. And commissioning should be done to actually fill the gaps. Well, I worked at City Hall for 12 years. One of the things I did was I was a commissioner for community-based services. And there are ways you can do this using bottom-up techniques that actually make sure that the specialist providers that we're talking about, groups like Sister Space, groups like Southall Black Sisters, etc., don't get frozen out, don't get squeezed out because big, more generic providers are able to offer lower unit costs. But you got to make a commitment to do that. And you've got to be really transparent. I would publish who's applied for funding and who's received it every single time. So you can start to see if there's a pattern that seems to be disadvantaging certain groups. And when it comes to, refuge spaces, we would absolutely put in place provision for 2,000 new refuge spaces, because even before the pandemic, 60% of referrals were turned away. They would all be accessible, and 50% would be by and for, ring-fence by and for Black and minoritized women, because we've got to actually deal with the supply and demand equation. You've got to acknowledge that the supply and the demand is not matching up when you look at people who need the services most. And so with respect to rape crisis centers, it is wrong that they have to continuously close their waiting lists. And actually, when it comes to funding, what can be done there is City Hall can say, right, like I did when I was a commissioner in City Hall, we got Comic Relief, we got Sport England, we got other big funders to pool their cash alongside ours so we can maximize our impact. Yes, you be a super lobbyist to get as much as possible out of the government, but you don't have to settle for the fact that the government are not always as responsive as we need them to be. Bring in extra funding from outside, make a point of doing that, and commission in a way that properly acknowledges the way those who need it most are typically shortchanged by traditional processes.
Thank you so much, Mandu. And I should say, before we go on to our next topic, I was going to call on you first on the next one, just if that's all right. Right, so the next topic is related, but we wanted to have a more specific focus on this. The theme, structural inequalities facing Black, minoritized and migrant women and marginalized communities. And two question areas within this. Migrant women experiencing domestic abuse who have no recourse to public funds struggle to access support because of hostile immigration policies, which perpetrators are able to use to exert even more control over victims of abuse. Will you commit to introducing a system of safe reporting so migrant women do not have to fear having their details passed to immigration enforcement if they report abuse? The second question on this theme, the government's race disparities report, which found this country did not have a case to answer on racism, has been widely criticised. If elected, will your party shine a light on structural racism and inequality that exists and impacts Black and minoritized women's access to safety, justice and support? So that's the topic. And I'm going to ask Mandu Reid of the Women's Equality Party to take it first. Thank you.
Yeah, I've already called for London to become a sanctuary city in defiance of the government's hostile environment policies. And what that would mean is, yeah, the Mayor of London would take a stand and would say, like has been done in different cities in the US, in San Francisco, in Chicago, they've done something similar. And it would say, here in London, no migrant woman will be denied access to the services and support she needs if she is fleeing violence. We're not going to have an apartheid system in a city that's run with Women's Equality Party influence at the top of the table. And it isn't just about making sure that the police don't report these individuals to the Home Office. It's about making sure they have safe accommodation and allowance, wraparound specialist support and legal advice and representation in the same way as a woman who doesn't have that stamp in her passport can access those services. And now we got to talk about that race report from the government. I am really appalled at that race report. But what I know is that race report was not written for me in mind. They were talking to other people who wanted to hear that institutional racism is a thing of the past. And we must not pander to that. We need to call this out wherever we see it. And we have to do that with confidence. And I would expect anybody who wants to be mayor of this city to be prepared to commit to call out institutional racism, whether it's uncomfortable to do so, whether it's in the police force, whether it's in any other institutions, and stand up defiantly and stridently against it. We have to have zero tolerance for any narrative that tries to betray the fact that this isn't happening in our city. And that might mean looking at commissioning models. I think there's a case to be answered that some of our commissioning models have structural racism built into them, because when you look at how the funds get distributed, there's an uncomfortable pattern there. So let's call those things out. And let's also interrogate ourselves when we call flippantly for things like more bobbies on the beat. I know what more bobbies on the beat means for people from my community. And so let's just be real and let's be clear about how racism manifests, and let's not shy away from challenging it and challenging it in ourselves as well.
Mandu, Reid, thank you so much. I'd like to call next on Labour's Sophie Linden to tackle this topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. In relation to the issue around migrant women and the firewall, Sadiq could not have been clearer, nor could Claire Waxman or myself be clearer as the need to make sure that not only is there a practical firewall, but actually it's put on a statutory footing, because it's one of the things that's just most disgraceful, that women who are victims of violence and young girls that are victims of violence, there is a tiering of response, because basically what the government is doing is saying we are not prepared to make sure that victims who are the most vulnerable, the most powerless and voiceless, they will not feel confident to come forward. We've been calling on, and through the Domestic Abuse Bill, put forward amendments and supported amendments to put that firewall in place. And it is frankly a disgrace that it is not being put in place. We're not going to give up fighting for that. And even though the Domestic Abuse Bill has nearly finished its course through Parliament, we're going to come back to the Police Sentencing and Courts Bill and try to get it back in. It's an ideological response from the government in order not to take this forward. We'll also make sure, in terms of the role as Police and Crime Commissioner that Sadiq has, if he were to be re-elected, we'll make sure that the super complaint and the recommendations from HMIC, that we oversee those recommendations and how the Metropolitan Police responds to it, because it is so important that women feel confident to come forward, and their status as a victim is the thing that matters to the police, not their immigration status, because that just cannot be right. Going on to that race report, Mandu's passion on that is absolutely right. I mean, it was just so disappointing. It's so intolerable that it's basically trying to disrespect and sort of not accept and acknowledge the systemic structural racism that all our public institutions have and the impact that has on not just women, but it does have on men as well. We can see that through the health service and the absolute disproportionate number of women who die in childbirth. But we can also see that within policing. And that's why Sadiq, we've put in place an action plan. And that action plan was not just about stop and search, and particularly around issues for young Black men. It was also, there was a particular part in it, because I was very, very keen to make sure this is the case, that we picked up the issues for Black women of how the police respond to their calls for service, what confidence and trust they have in the police to come forward, because many Black women have told us and have told the roundtables, have spoken out during roundtables that Claire Waxman has hosted, that they don't feel confident to come forward to report, because they are worried as to what type of service they'll get, whether they'll be taken seriously, but also if the perpetrator is a Black man, how fairly they will be treated. Sadiq is clear there has to be a zero tolerance attitude to any form of racism, and so is the Commissioner. She's been very clear in response to the action plan that that the Met isn't free of racism, discrimination and bias, and we are absolutely to tackling that and to making sure that that changes.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Sorry to cut you off just as you were coming to a natural conclusion there. And I'd like to call now on the Conservatives' Louise Calland on this issue. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to talk first about a scheme that we want to extend really into London for women who have no resource to fund. And this is the Rail to Refuge scheme. So it's already a national scheme, and we wanted to roll it out permanently across Transport for London. So Essentially, this is for victims escaping domestic abuse or other situations who need to travel to find refuge with availability, as they might not have availability at the nearest refuge. And also as well, cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of economic abuse that often goes along with domestic abuse, which can, again, prevent people from having resource to these funds that they need to get where they need to go, to get their children to where they need to go. So this is going to be providing free train travel to the allocated domestic violence refuge. This is run not by TfL, but it will be affiliated with it. So again, if there were any worries about data being shared, then that would people should feel confident that their data wouldn't be shared with any kind of Home Office database. So they should feel safe. It's been run by an independent charity to use that to enable them to get where they need to go free of charge whenever they need to get there. I think I also want to address.
Can I just check, are you happy to continue, or do you want me to come back to you? I'm conscious that Calland Jr. in the background is.
I'm so sorry. I'm so
sorry.
No,
you do not need to apologise to this audience, but please plough on. I didn't also want to stop you in your stride, so please continue.
Sorry, thank you. And then I just wanted to touch as well on the report. So just to say that it's not a government report so much as a government commissioned independent report. And so the government is, of course, as it does with all its reports that commissions, looking at the recommendations within it and how it should inform future policy, but they are hugely committed to ensuring that there is fair within that all of our structures within our society are fair and equal. And lastly, to say, of course, that Sean has got many years of experience of working with particularly sort of young Black men across many backgrounds across London. He is as committed to working towards a fairer London as anybody and ensuring that all women feel safe.
Thank you so much, Louise. And as I say, at any stage, you know, obviously we can accommodate if you need to take a quick step away and come back, but
thank you.
Fantastic work.
Turn my camera off for 30 seconds.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. We all completely empathise. Right, I'd like to call next on the Greens, Mary Ean, for your thoughts on this. Mary.
Thank you. I'd just like to reiterate the huge disappointment that MPs voted against supporting migrant women as part of the domestic abuse bill. And one of the things that really sort of has highlighted to me the precariousness that women in that situation are is through some work I've done with a local charity, where we've been providing these women with things to meet their basic needs, including milk for their babies that they can't access anywhere else. And if that doesn't show how precarious the situation people are in, I don't know what does. But thinking about migrant women more generally, the Green Party supports freedom of movement, and we would work to end the hostile environment and mitigate its effects on our citizens. And we would work to ensure that there's no sharing of information between immigration enforcement and services under the remit of the mayor. And where we don't have power to change policy, we campaign hard for reform and review the impact of police policies and police sharing of immigration status data, and bring evidence to policymakers and MPs about how much harm that causes. Regarding the race report, well, it's clear that institutionalized racism does exist, and the recent report has been widely discredited by academics, health professionals and others. And we need to listen to the evidence and lived experience of Black and minority women. And Green Party representatives will continue to campaign and stand up against racist government policy in order to make our systems and processes fair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And finally on this topic, the Liberal Democrats, Irina von Wiese, over to you.
Thank you, Samira. And I'm glad in a way that you called me last, and particularly that I get to speak after the Conservative representative, because with all due respect to Louise, this is the point where I'm afraid I do get very angry at our central government. I have hosted since 2015. I hosted a young refugee woman from Ethiopia. She came to live with us because she was homeless. She had escaped a family who had held her as a domestic slave for many, many years. So it brought her to the UK without papers from Saudi Arabia. She was repeatedly raped at the hands of her employers. And she eventually managed to find shelter with a charity, and then referred to me. I was volunteering for a charity called Refugees at home. And she stayed with us for almost 4 years. Her first asylum claim had failed. Her second asylum claim also failed on the basis that Ethiopia was not a dangerous country and she could return there despite the fact that she was a member of a minority ethnic group that was persecuted there. But most importantly, Priti Patel's hostile environment and her predecessors' already hostile environment did not care that she was a rape victim, did not care that she had nowhere to go. They wanted to deport her. And eventually, when her second asylum claim failed, she was sent a letter that said that she had 7 days, that within 7 days she had to report, or she would be deported from the UK. She was forced to go underground. She couldn't stay with us anymore because our address then was known, and she was too scared to stay with us. And unfortunately, I'm still in contact with her, but I know that she will never be able to live a normal life. That is just simply not in any way human. It's unbelievable. And frankly, in light of this hostile environment, something like the race report just sounds so hollow. Because the vast majority of these people who come tend to be not white. And very, very many of the women who are refugees in London have been subject to threats or indeed perpetration of sexual violence. There are so many of these women who still live underground. So the answer is very, very clear. If Louise is elected as mayor, she will do everything possible to ensure that those women can report without fear for their immigration status. And indeed, if I'm elected to the Assembly, I will make sure to hold any mayor to account over this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We move on to our final topic now, and we're only going to ask for a 1 minute answer from each of our representatives on this before drawing events to a close. And it's about housing policy connections to violence against women and girls. There's a lot of attention to housing in this election, with commitments made by each mayoral candidate to new and affordable housing. The housing crisis in London is having a severe and catastrophic effect on women and their families, putting them at risk of homelessness and, for example, seeing women who are forced to flee abuse lose their secure tenancies and made more vulnerable for the long term. How would your party's housing strategy build in thinking and policy to ensure the safety of every woman and girl across London? And for this, I would like to ask each of our speakers to have just 1 minute. And I'd like to start with the Green Party representative, Mary Eames. Over to you.
Okay, I'll try and keep it snappy. Greens on the London Assembly have worked to expose the problems faced by more and more Londoners who lose their homes every year through no fault of their own, and women, including those facing domestic abuse, are some of the worst affected. And Sian Berry's committed to using the powers of the Mayor's office to build more homes and take more action to fix the temporary accommodation crisis. And we'd push for legislation in Parliament that guarantees victims of domestic abuse the right to remain in their homes if they wish, and for this right to apply across all tenancies. And we'd make sure there's a consistent and fair assessment by councils of vulnerability and health needs. And also, one of our key policies is a universal basic income, which we've been pushing for trials of in London.
Last few seconds, please.
Women having access to a basic income gives them the freedom to choose to leave an abusive relationship.
Fantastic. Mary, thank you very much. Sorry, thank you so much, Mary. And our next speaker on this final issue with a minute is the Women's Equality Party candidate, Mandu Reid. Over to you.
Even with the best will in the world, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. We've already spoken about that in relation to policing, but housing is another area in London where the ecosystem's really broken and women are at the sharp end of it. So very simply, my housing strategy would focus ruthlessly on social housing, and 5% of new and existing social housing provision would be ring fenced for survivors of domestic abuse, because you can't have a situation where you have a bottleneck in refuges, even if you increase provision, but there's nowhere for the women to move on to. So very simply, implementing that would make a significant difference and would start to change the structural issues that hold women back and keep them stuck in violent relationships.
Mandu Reid, thank you very much. I'd like to call next on the Liberal Democrats, Irina von Wiese. Over to you.
Thank you. So housing is actually at the core of Louise Porritt's strategy for London, and based on the fact that Sadiq Khan has failed to deliver affordable houses for London, he's only really started half the number of affordable homes he's promised. So Liberal Democrats will set up a London housing company that will take control of delivering the homes that we need directly by bringing empty properties back into use. I've mentioned this earlier, some of which need to be designated as shelters, but also maximizing use of public land and raising revenue to build new sites. We also urgently need to end homelessness, not just for women fleeing violence, but specifically for them. Every Londoner deserves the right to shelter, and we will work towards a housing first policy where a roof over your head is a right and not subject to any other conditions. We also, like the Green Party, support a universal basic income, which should ensure that no woman is forced to stay in an abusive relationship.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to call next on the Conservatives, Louise Calland.
Thank you. So I'll go back to the new Deputy Mayor for Women and Equalities, who would be one of their roles would be to ensure that actually the Housing Department were joined up with the Women and Equalities policies that we have, so to ensure that actually all of these things were considered across every aspect of our policy making across London. One of our big policies within housing is, of course, 100,000 homes for £100,000. So this is to try and ensure there are a lot of new houses in London that are genuinely affordable for people and under shared ownership. So this would be to ensure that where people have limited access to funds. I'm thrilled to see the government the other day have announced now 95% mortgages are now going to be made available. So this is really about ensuring that the housing provision is there for people who want to be able to purchase somewhere, but of course creating homes for London in the same way that we have transport for London, so that becomes directly under the Mayor's access, and he can build the houses that are so badly needed and unfortunately haven't been built under the current Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And am I right in thinking we have one person left to speak? I haven't missed anyone, which is the Labour representative, Sophie Linden. Yes, Sophie, over to you. Your thoughts on this?
Got there. Brilliant. Just really briefly, I suppose there's four things I'd say is overarching more housing, and Sadiq has been very, has delivered on more housing and is well on course to deliver on 10,000 new council homes, which will take some of the pressure off temporary accommodation. The second thing is that through the mayor's move on accommodation, sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister, 20% of that housing is allocated and is ring fenced for women fleeing domestic abuse and domestic violence. Really important aspect of ring fence funding. The third thing is the London Housing Reciprocal, which the Mayor funds, which has rehoused over 300 women and their children when they've had to flee violence. Not just rehouse them, but made sure that they're in secure and safe accommodation and sustainable accommodation. And I think the fourth thing is really thinking about this is dealing where the system has failed, that women have had to move because of violence. We need to tackle the perpetrators of violence, we need to intervene early, and we need to make sure that women stay in their homes and the men leave, because that's where we'll get justice.
Sophie Linden, thank you. I can't thank you all enough for taking on these big topics. It's been a really valuable conversation to have. So let me quickly just thank Councillor Louise Calland, Mary Ian of the Greens, Sophie Linden of Labour, Irina von Wiese of the Liberal Democrats, and Mandu Reid of the Women's Equality Party, Louise, of course, from the Conservatives. Thank you to everyone who's participated with the excellent comments going on in the chat. I'm going to hand back now to Andrea Simon.
Thank you, Samira. I just want to end by extending a huge thanks on behalf of the End Violence Against Women Coalition, Imkaan and Women's Resource Centre to all of you panellists. It's been a very rich discussion, and a huge thanks also to Samira Ahmed for chairing this so brilliantly. Thanks also to our signers and the panel typists who've made this an accessible event. We know that there's so many areas that we could have covered, and that the Mayor and the Assembly members need to be across when it comes to tackling violence against women and girls. And we know that there's been a lot of commentary that's been put on the chat box. So thank you to all the attendees who've posted questions and comments in there. We will collate that and we will share it with the candidates for Mayor as well. And we just like to say that we commit to working with those elected to City Hall to ensure that women and girls' voices are heard, and we are factored into the policies that affect our lives. So huge thank you again. This has been a really good event. Take care, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for organising.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is really important.